Welcome back to what is scheduled to be the last Monday sessions. We've come so far. So we've got two wonderful speakers this week. We've got Eoghan and Magdalene from UC School of Geography, and we've got Donal Lally from TU Dublin and Annex, part of the... From here originally, yeah. There we go. The theme this week is urban systems. So the two talks are quite deal with kind of similar themes, but they're also quite diverse. So we're going to have Donal speak first, and then we're going to have a few questions, then we're going to have Eoghan, then maybe a few questions, and then if we want we can have a small discussion afterwards, kind of around the two. Open floor. So so Donal Lally. Donal Lally is a practicing architect, lecturer and PhD researcher based at TU Dublin. Donal's research project focuses on the material infrastructures of the internet, with a particular focus on how the production and consumption of data is reorganizing the fabric of human and non-human habitats. Donal has recently published related articles in Arch Plus as part of a special issue on post-human architecture, and Strelka magazine as part of a series on new urban conditions. Through his architectural practice, Zero Degree Machine, Donal explores how infrastructural thinking can be deployed across different scales of the built environment. Donal received his B.Arch from UCD and is a PhD researcher at the Graduate School of Creative Arts GradCam TU Dublin, in collaboration with the EU Mary Curie funded Real Smart Cities project. it's always the end that gets
I didn't realise it along by sentences.
Donal is a founding member of Annex, the multidisciplinary team responsible for Entanglement, the Irish Pavilion at the Venice Architecture Biennale 2020. Without further ado, give a warm welcome to Donal.
Hi, thanks. I don't really have much to add to that. So I'm just going to be talking about sheds today and fire. So we'll get started. In his 1851 text, The Four Elements of Architecture, architectural theorist Gottfried Semper put forward fire as the first and most important element of architecture. For Semper, the first human groups assembled and formed alliances and developed religious concepts around the domesticated fire. For Semper, quote, throughout all phases of society, the heart formed that sacred focus around which took order and shape, end quote. Fire is both meta-organic and meta-cultural. It is more than a natural phenomenon, more than a technology. It is a primary shaper in our human society. Fire, like a human animal, is a process. It breathes oxygen, emits heat, needs to be fed, bred, trained and maintained. Fire is an agent in its own right, an agent without consciousness. It's an actor possessing the power to shape the course of human and non-human habitats. Ancient Europeans, having tamed the garden, paving the way for the agricultural revolution, then sought to subordinate fire to the rule of order. So in Latin, the word hearth means focus. The hearth fire became the focus of social life. First, houses were built around the hearth, and villages and cities were constructed around communal hearths, which often took the form of a perpetual flame. For Europeans, the orderly and obedient anthropogenic hearth fire became a sacred symbol for a disciplined and orderly society. According to the environmental historian Stephen J. Pine, quote, civilization would be impossible without fire. In ancient Rome, a sacred order, the Vestal Virgins, sustained the Ignis Vestae, or Vestal flame, at the Temple of Vestae. This is dedicated to the goddess of the heart. The Pontifex Maximus demanded celibacy to ensure absolute dedication to the task. For Romans, the shrine of Vestae predated all others. It had no inauguration, for it always been. Keeping the flame alive and under control was seen as vital to maintaining the shape and order of Roman society. Domesticated fire belonged to the hearth and to the altar. Natural fire belonged to the primitive fringes where society begins to break down. Pine describes how over time Europe came to resemble a fire whose core had burned out, a smouldering glow at the centre with flickering flames at the edges. For historian Lewis Mumford, infrastructural technologies are container technologies. Container technology such as the hearth or the data center, foregrounds the figure while making invisible the ground. The hearth foregrounding the flame, and the data center foregrounding the cloud. Simply put, a data center, for those, and we're all pretty much well aware what these are, but for those who maybe aren't aware, it's basically a container which organizes a company's ICT, information and communication technology equipment, such as servers, computer servers, switching systems and storage facilities. I'll get into a little bit more about that later. But a data center essentially manages the environmental conditions of these computational systems. They're really designed to make ICT systems operate reliably, safely, and efficiently. As we know, the global data center industry consumes vast amounts of energy, but it also generates vast amounts of heat. A proposed, now cancelled Apple facility, which was located in Atrophied, Plan 2, was projected to consume as much electricity as a medium-sized Irish city, roughly 230,000 homes. When fully operational, the new Amazon development in Dublin is forecast to consume as much as 4% of Ireland's total electricity demand. By 2027, EirGrid predict, and this is conservative, the total data centre industry will consume as much as 31% of Ireland's overall electricity demand. So 1/3 of all of our electricity will go into data centres in some shape or form within 7 years. So data centres themselves are currently responsible for about 3% of global electricity consumption. Huawei predicts that number will increase to about 15% by 2030. So 3% at the moment, again conservative figures, up to 15% within a decade of total global electricity consumption. The increase in power consumption of data centres is not just a function of increasing size, but also of increasing server density. Demand continues to move faster than supply. 90%, in 2016, IBM released a report that said that 90% of the world's data had been created in the previous 2 years. So between 2014 and 2016, 90% of the world's data had been produced. So following Jevons paradox, efficiency does not actually reduce consumption, but increases it. So the more efficient, the more storage we create, the more data we're producing to fill it. Modern technologies do not reveal the sources of their power, but transform them unrecognisably. A philosopher of elemental media, John Durham Peters, sees electricity as a kind of repressed fire. The Vestal virgins maintained the Vestal fire's purity through a strict diet of oak tree called materia. The oak tree is statistically the most likely to be hit by lightning, and it was thus a kind of pan-cultural symbol of the gods of lightning, such as Zeus and Thor. So lightning purifies the oak feeds the Vestal flame. So data centers consume a much dirtier materia, produced at the edges to maintain its perpetual warm glow. In only 10 years of global data center proliferation, essentially a new industry has emerged whose carbon emissions are equal to that of the airline industry. So again, if 90% of all data was produced in those 2 years, or could be produced in those 2 years, one must assume that this unprecedented explosion in data production and consumption cannot be supported with a parallel surge in clean energy production. So the speed of data production can't really be kind of equated with the renewable backup energy. Ireland relies primarily on fossil fuels. It's around 70% of our electricity. Again, those figures are not exact, they're fuzzy at best. Amazon, Microsoft and Google all offer AI services and cloud service to the fossil fuel industry to aid in the streamlining of extraction of oil and gas. So while all three make significant efforts to eliminate fossil fuels from their in-house company operations, they still appear intent on maintaining the global supply of fossil-derived energy. For Durham Peters, quote, "Our bodies are fire containers, each cell an image of the Vestal hearth. Heat control is one of the classic cybernetic processes that unite humans and machines, and heat control remains the central design problem for the chief medium of our time, the computer." So Intel themselves are working on, let's say, cold computers, where instead of transmitting data through wires, you're transmitting it through light. So eradicating heat from computation is a sort of key design challenge. So too much heat causes server failure, theoretically. This makes the design and manufacture of thermal management systems one of the most challenging parts of data center design. A data center radically transforms the quality of energy it consumes. So essentially, to be really basic about it, it takes in high-grade electricity and expels large quantities of low-grade heat. As Julia Velkova, a media theorist, points out, quote, intense computation processes can make server rooms reach temperatures of 35 to 45 degrees Celsius. And that kind of normally results in server failure. So she kind of points out that really the world is sort of obsessed with the input, but actually we don't seem to be too concerned with the output, which is heat. So the input being electricity consumption, but the output being heat, doesn't seem to be kind of part of the public discourse around the data center. A computer server, to be really reductive about it, it takes electricity, or a computer takes electricity and uses it in three ways. And the majority is converted to heat through computational effort. And so that's number one. The next portion is used to drive fans to actually push the heat away from the server. And a very small amount is used to drive electrons and photons on the network interface. So the actual transmission of data is a fraction of the energy that's used in computers. The majority is the production of heat, and the next amount is actually just getting rid of that heat, and the tiny amount being the transmission of data. Telia, a large Finnish data center operator, their new data center generates about 200 gigawatt hours of heat annually. 1 gigawatt hour being roughly equivalent to 412 wind turbines. So it gives you the scale of electricity consumption and then the output of heat from those. So vast amounts of energy are used to cool server room floors to optimal industry standards. They're taking the heat down from about 40 to 50 degrees Celsius down to 10, somewhere between 10 and 22. This is Google's data center in Sandvies Lane in Belgium, and it's designed actually to rise above 35 degrees in the summer months. But when it does that, the server hall becomes a kind of data furnace, not habitable by workers. So there's a point, within these kind of architectures, now they're experimenting with spaces that aren't habitable by humans, or allowed to be uninhabitable. For Durham Peters' quote, container technologies show media at their most environmental. And again, I think the questions and answers I can talk a bit more about the environmental nature of these spaces, or the environment there. A feral spark can be extraordinarily destructive. The Temple of Vesta burned down 4 times, at least 4 times. In 2014, the world witnessed a contemporary mining accident. A 5 megawatt server farm in Bangkok, exclusively tasked to mine Bitcoin, burned to the ground as a result of an electrical fire. The press reported that hundreds of rigs were destroyed, millions of dollars, hundreds of thousands of millions of dollars in damage. But the Bangkok fire illustrates the risks in running high-density computing equipment in buildings operating without advanced electrical infrastructure or fire suppression systems. So the safest, and there's a kind of key point here again, the safest and most energy-efficient data centers compete for global locations that are the most politically stable, have colder climates, and have already invested in the most advanced network infrastructure, enabling abundant access to fast and reliable network connections. So the big operators move to the places that have already invested in infrastructure and already have climates kind of ready to set up and already have governments that are politically stable and conducive to working over long periods. So, while speaking of ancient Rome, Pine stated that, quote, desired fire belongs to the heart of the altar. Unwanted fire appears along the rough fringes of an unraveling society, in the cracks of disintegrating cities. So in an affirmation of the global digital divide, unsafe server farms, such as the Bangkok mine, will find their homes where building regulation is the weakest. The data center is kind of the heart around which gathers the most pervasive of contemporary metacultural megastructures, the data economy. So from the landing of the world's first transatlantic telegraph cable on Valentia Island over 150 years ago to its present status, to our present status as a strategic location for hosting data technology infrastructure and services, Ireland has played a unique role in the historical development of global network communications and technologies. So we're more of a node or a landing point rather than a leader, but we have we are woven or have been woven or weaved into this kind of story, this historical story of planetary scale information and communication systems. So Ireland, as we all know in this room, is currently headquarters to Amazon, Facebook, Google and Microsoft, as well as many other technology companies that are maybe less known. And we kind of know the reasons. I'm not going to go through them why they're here. But at the end of 2018, beginning of 2019, Dublin overtook London to become Europe's largest data hosting cluster, surpassing London with about 25, we're about 25-26% of the European market, London about 25 to be 4. And as a result of this kind of rapid expansion, we've seen a rapid production in data centres across our urban landscapes, suburban, ex-urban landscapes. There's currently 53 data centres, but Amazon, Facebook and Microsoft are rapidly building, well, Facebook are doubling their size, Amazon are continuously kind of putting in planning applications for new data centres. But we're expecting to see that number double in the next kind of couple of years. And currently there's a bill waiting to be ratified in the Dáil that would redesignate data centres as strategic infrastructure. So they become kind of categorically similar to major roads and bridges, but maybe more like incinerators. That would probably be a better comparison. So we're taking these things and we're starting to put them at the centre of our society. We're calling them important and we're putting them to the centre of our society. If a data centre fails to maintain its perpetual fire, the order and shape of society breaks down. The business model for the cloud itself is based on volume, stability, and efficiency of delivery. So in 2017, over 75,000 people had their 3-day weekend plans destroyed when British Airways suffered a massive data centre failure. Passengers lost luggage, immense frustration caused from delayed flights, and sorts of other things. The airline lost about $112 million in 3 days. So the downtime was caused by a single engineer who disconnected and incorrectly reconnected the power supply, triggering a power surge that disrupted the whole infrastructure of operations. But what we're seeing is an institute called the Uptime Institute to monitor these sort of accidents. They say that these kind of human errors are contributing more and more to the downtime of like large volumes of information and the infrastructure that supports them. So as we rely more and more on the cloud to manage our society, we rely more and more on the data centre to maintain the cloud's order and shape. The global trend is moving towards a much larger hyperscale data centre. Many organisations with small and medium scale data centres are continually to basically cut it short, a business or a large kind of corporation might have its own in-house data centre, which is simply a room full of computers that houses its kind of its information. But as they are migrating their information to the cloud, they're migrating it into the ecosystems of, say, Amazon, Google, or whoever. So a typical data centre may support hundreds of thousands of physical servers and hundreds of physical servers and thousands of virtual machines. A hyperscale facility may support thousands of physical support servers and millions of virtual machines. So an individual hyperscale data center would typically have a footprint, technically has a footprint more than around 10,000 square meters, but it's really often much, much more. Like this is the Amazon planning application from Mulhuddard, and this is 165,000 square meters when fully operational. It's going to be built in 8 stages. So it's the combined equivalent of 24 football pitches. Out of interest, I think the Apple Rise site was the equivalent of about 28 Liberty Halls. So you can kind of get a sense of the scale of these buildings with virtually no people working in them. Hyperscale data centers are forecast to host about 60% of the share of the global total of data center server space by 2021. So that's this year, next year. And in Ireland, these hyperscale data centers are typically designed and operated by the large. So we have many of them here already. Google, Amazon, Facebook all have hyperscale data centers, and Amazon have many. And there's 5 in Tala alone. So again, in a partnership in 2018, Tala and Amazon announced they were partnering on a scheme to reuse the exhausted waste heat from the 5th of their newest their data centers into Tala. So they're going to plug Tala into the exhaust pipes of the Amazon system, and into the data center exhaust pipes will be plugged Rua Red Gallery. There's about 1,700 residential units, a Tala Hospital, TU Dublin Tala campus. There's about 44,000 metres squared of built space is going to be plugged into the exhaust pipes of these structures. So technically, it's been sold as a kind of carbon emission, a win regarding carbon. It's forecast reduced the emissions by Tala by about 1,900 tonnes per year. But we kind of have to think a little bit about how the energy comes into the data centre. So it's not, yes, you're taking the carbon emissions out of Tala, but you're displacing them somewhere else, because the vast quantities of electricity used to pump that, to fuel that data centre, you know, that electricity is coming from somewhere else, and 70% of it is probably fossil fuels. So it's kind of an active displacement. In 2016, DeepMind, the AI artificial intelligence arm of Alphabet, so it's Google, announced it was training several neural networks with a type of machine learning called reinforcement learning to regulate the management of Google's data centers and cooling operations. So reinforcement learning teaches a computational system essentially what to do and how to map situations to actions to maximize, you know, and reward. So the kind of key takeaway being the learner is not told, the machine, the algorithm is not told which actions to take, but it must discover the kind of actions itself. It's given a goal, and it can figure out its own route to that goal. So in a data center, cooling is typically carried out by large mechanical devices such as pumps, chillers, and cooling towers. They're quite dynamic environments, both in the complexity of their operational systems, but also how those systems interact with the external environments such as the weather. So they may appear totally contextless in the way that they're designed and kind of portrayed, but they are deeply contextual in a way. They don't reflect that in the facade. It has a kind of unique architecture, a unique relationship to the environment. Physical architecture and the systems architecture that is designed for one context may not be applicable to another. So DeepMind's algorithm, this AI algorithm, is trained to learn from existing data sets generated from Google's global data center operations, in addition to simulating millions of other potential scenarios and developing a general intelligence based on trial and error. So this is an algorithm trained on all its data centers and all other data centers, and then all of these other, and then any other kind of condition that can be fed into the data set. So the thing is learning about things that haven't happened, could happen, may not happen, previous experience, and all that sort of stuff, and generating new conditions based on kind of those data sets. So in 2018, Google said it effectively handed over control to the algorithm, which autonomously manages cooling in several of their large data centers. Now, Google don't have a massive amount of data centers, just the ones they have are enormous. And the AI yields very, very impressive results. So it on average saves about 30% on energy usage per month. According to Google, once it was given autonomous control of its kind of, at an industrial scale, at a planetary scale, quote, it was amazing to see that the AI learned to take advantage of winter conditions, produce colder than normal water, which reduces energy, blah, blah, blah. You kind of get the idea that the system was now doing things that they themselves wouldn't have even predicted. There's a case study in somewhere in kind of the Midwest, or is it maybe Oregon, I think, where the data center, it was being the actions were being supervised by an operator within the data center. They were just looking at the AI's actions, and it was taking very counterintuitive measures. Like it was just turning off the cooling operations at one point, and it was turning them on, and they were dropping heat or raising heat. And in isolation, it couldn't really be read like in a kind of local way. It could only be read once all of the macro data from Google's global kind of data center operations could be taken into account. So it's these things. This algorithm is operating on kind of not at a local level, but at a kind of macro level and a local level. So according to Google, rules don't get better over time, but an AI does. So Google see the system being rolled out beyond data centers, applying it to other settings, and even helping tackle climate change at scale. But in feeding oil and gas extraction and through maintenance through its heat distribution systems, these contemporary perpetual hearts are the kind of powerful machine learning algorithms assuming the mantle of the contemporary vestal virgin. So DeepMind's data center management algorithm is the most high-profile example of autonomous AI data center management systems. So, but one must assume that Amazon, if it doesn't have it already, they're very secretive. They don't tell you anything. So they possibly do have in-house AI systems that are managing their kind of infrastructure. So it's plausible to think that the cooling operations at Tala will at some point be governed by AI. So a couple of questions come out. from that, come from that. What does it mean when a private industrial scale AI system is plugged into a civic realm? A municipal AI system would be trained, one would hope, to ensure a balanced human and non-human ecology. For example, a municipal district heating AI system could make explicit the cybernetic processes at play that unite fire, the human and the machine. And it could collectively lower the heat in a neighbourhood's homes in order to save an energy centre from overloading or causing outages, a true ecology in some ways. Or it may use real-time global weather models in combination with carbon footprint models, cross-referenced with building use and occupancy data to efficiently manage the collective energy sources of a neighbourhood ecosystem, one inclusive of animal, vegetable, mineral and machinic users. A private AI would have different goals. It would simply, above all else, secure the data. Security of the data. So on the face of it, Amazon's data centre, recycling its waste heat into the community would appear a sensible idea. And if implemented correctly, it would act as a model to be used to make data centres the glowing hearts of communities across the globe. A community gathers around and plugs into these new mega hearts. As communities gather around and plug into these new mega hearts, are we witnessing the latest morphology of a society shaped by fire? For Romans, the vessel of fire represented the health of civic society. These neo-hearts represent the interests of private capital. So is the smart city's most radical manifestation occurring in our hot water pipes? As we outpace Eoghan's paradox, producing and consuming exponentially more and more data, we are exhausting more and more heat. Contemporary global society has become a data furnace, spewing heat into an atmosphere already burning up. To media theorist Nicole Starosielski, the language of thermodynamics can help us describe the extensive transformations of technological modernity, one that is heating up, increasing in entropy, and ultimately moving towards heat death. Perhaps the dilemma could be more prophetically observed by the poet John Donal. Fire ever doth aspire, and makes all like itself, turns all to fire. Thank you.
Questions? Thank you. It's a lot to take in.
If it makes sense, I hope it did.
Yeah.
I can lead with some questions if you want. Just the environmental spaces of these buildings is really interesting. I know of a kind of group of students who tried to get in. They invented a fake startup and got in just to There's different types of data centers. So like Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and Facebook are all closed systems. You can't get into them. They won't let you in. But there's other data centers called co-location data centers, where basically the infrastructure is set up, the shed is built, the fibre optic and the electricity is brought in, and the server halls are subdivided into kind of lots and lots of spaces, in which a company can come in and just plug in its systems into the data center. And then they can actually literally drag cables from one company, like AIB can drag a cable and plug into the Vodafone network, and it means that they get a kind of internal network going. So what's really interesting is you can get into these, and I'd advise anybody to try. A server hall space is extremely noisy and it can blow extremely hot and cold. So the first sense is not this kind of cool, abstract 2001 The Space Odyssey sort of experience of a day, this kind of PR image of data. So the first sensation is purely kind of bodily. Your skin is hit with sensations of hot and cold, and your ears are hit with noise that can be as loud as sort of an airport landing strip. So you're kind of disorientated. You have to shout to talk to a person next to you. And what kind of concretizes this in my mind is an interesting one. The guy who gave me a tour around it, when they set up the server halls first, there was no companies in there. So there were just these empty cages, but the room was cooled to minus 25 degrees. So there was an Israeli computer game company were the first ones to come in, and they were setting up, and they were in like these kind of cold storage gear, clothes with kind of goggles and face masks, and these huge kind of lamb's wool kind of out in the corner in freezing cold, trying to plug in their systems, which is not a kind of image you ever connect with kind of computers or computer server rooms. So these rooms they're these kind of climactic environments all to themselves, are very kind of radical climactic environments, which is something I'd like to kind of get across to people about how these places operate. Because the data center industry does not want you to know. If you get a sense of sound or you get a sense of heat and cold, you immediately think of energy. where is the energy going and how is that controlled. So how they control the image is they give you these kind of very aloof, austere, distant images, like these kind of images that, again, it's like 1960s sci-fi or something like that. So the way the PR works is very different to the reality of these spaces. And also when you see the images, there's rarely any people in them, because people are the #1 cause of downtime. So they cut the people out, they love the idea of like a completely humanless environment, because it means safety to all their customers. So the image of data centers is completely different to the reality of data centers, and there's a kind of like, there's a fiction created between the reality and the public, which is kind of interesting, I think.
Sorry, Gary. So, just finished Sue Boss' book on extractive capitalism.
Yeah.
One thing she doesn't deal with is the whole data center phenomenon, but what she does talk about is how companies like Facebook and Google have made money from digital exhaust.
Yes.
So in other words, they take all the things, the likes, the shares, the pictures, the emotions, and monetize them.
Yeah.
And I think it works on the same principle, that you obscure the real process by putting a nice shiny front face on it, which is all the things that we look at on Snapchat, Facebook, and Twitter. But the actual background is recording your location, the times you engage, the amount of times you hover over a certain ad. All of that stuff is kind of taken away and put through those data centers. So do you think that there's a kind of a correlate there between the production process, in other words, us producing all these likes and shares, and the secondary production process that occurs? Because this is a money-making exercise after all. They're not doing it for good or health. So.
No, you're dead right. They're both the same. It's like black boxing. The minute you shroud, as again, the data exhaust is really interesting. It's quite interesting that they're literally selling. Well, I don't know actually about the kind of business model of the Tala project, because actually Amazon don't talk about it. South Dublin Council talk about it. Amazon don't talk about it. So I don't know if it's a condition of the planning application that they were forced into by South Dublin County Council, or else there's something that they're trying to get into as kind of utility investment in some kind of way. I don't know. But I do think there is a correlate. It's the way they work. It's kind of shrouding, hiding processes all the way through, because the processes are so. Once you kind of open up the processes, like even from, if you open up the data production processes, you get to exactly what you're talking about, the production of saleable information that's not exactly connected to the thing that you think you're buying. You open up the iPhone and you realise it's stuffed full of rare earth minerals that are coming from like Indonesia and the Congo and that sort of stuff. And then you look at the data centres and you follow the energy, and you kind of go, well, this is mainly fossil fuels that burns the internet, you know. We're building this connection between France and Ireland, the Celtic interconnector, which is going to, I presume, is bringing nuclear generated electricity into Ireland. So again, these processes are all hidden from us. Even the idea of the data centre in Ireland, which is an interesting kind of discourse in and of itself, like it is doing things that are being produced elsewhere. So we're a puff of heat in Clonee out of a data centre in Clonee is being generated by somebody on Tinder in maybe like kind of Malaysia or something like that. So like somebody gets kind of horny in Malaysia and like heat is produced in kind of Clonee. And we're talking about these kind of radically weird processes that are happening. Like again, it's something what we're doing. We're hoping to kind of manifest it more with the Venice project, is kind of manifest the materiality of the actions, the supposed immaterial actions that are connected to the internet. And for architects especially, and urban planners, I think the idea that somebody is swiping in Tinder is actually creating built space, like physical architecture, reorganizing kind of urban complexes in Tala. So data itself is producing space, and we're the site of that space in Ireland. Or anything else? Yeah.
Just on that, Donal, just following up on this thing, the location of these, particularly as they scale up, the location has, well, not quite true, but it's tended towards invisibility as much as possible, or not being urban, being ex-urban, or quasi-rural or whatever. But is there any notion, as with the Tala project, that there's now a thought that they might actually much more closely integrate
with communities?
They might become more urban, or more like a co-located kind of infrastructure, because there's a sort of reciprocal, that they become more embedded or something like that. or less?
It's an interesting, again, there's so many typologies of data centers. So many, see in Amsterdam, there's a Equinix have built a tower, which looks like a giant hard drive. Like it's a kind of, computer people are building it. So the idea of an urban scale hard drive to some people is kind of a nice idea. But that is an example where they're visualizing. It's becoming something that's part of the skyline. When it comes to the bigger tech companies, it seems that they want to stay as far away from people as possible. They don't want people near them. I think the only job for people in the near future in these data centers will be to turf other humans off. But there's also, I was talking to a philosopher recently, there's a real problem with imagination with these projects, or these buildings, and that he was kind of talking about, he was from a town in southern Italy that had, I can't remember exactly, but it had some kind of industrial heart to the town. And he was talking about, as a child, his friend's parents go to work in this factory. And the parents would come back with stories in the factory. The child would kind of imagine a way into the factory. It would become a kind of relationship, like before the child gets into the factory to see it as a young adult, they have this kind of mental image of the kind of processes and a world, like a Willy Wonka's chocolate factory kind of imagination of what's inside the factory. These things are completely black box, so when you put them into a community, you're creating a void at the community that is actually impenetrable in lots of ways, kind of both imaginatively, but also kind of physically, I think, as well. So there's something really weird and interesting about that as well. Like, they are conceptually impenetrable. Although the French have kind of, which is really interesting, in northern France, in northern Paris, the Plain Commune, they had this problem, like a little, they've had this since the early 2000s, but there was a point where they were building so many data centers, they saturated the energy grid and no more production could happen. So the kind of local kind of activist groups started going, well, what are these bloody things? They just saturated our environment. It's happened without us, we haven't even noticed these things actually popping up. So these groups did, and they were kind of like communist, left-leaning groups, which is kind of interesting. They looked at them, but they didn't look at them they looked at them first with, they're producing all this electricity, they're emitting all this heat. At first they were kind of pushing these companies to think about plugging the heat into the kind of municipal supplies. But what they did, which was quite radical, is they started to kind of discuss the buildings not as large banks of computers, but as processing environments, which was kind of interesting. So they basically were saying, well, what's in that? What's that building doing? Okay, that one has got like an online betting company in it. So that's a casino. That's a casino. And this one has pornography in it. That's like a pornography. So we're going to look at these buildings like they are, that's what they do, that's what they are. So, it could be anything, but it's a way, which is really interesting, it's a way of imagining your way into the process. They don't just become these computers that are sort of like objective. They become kind of like processes that have you wouldn't allow a casino into your neighborhood, so why would you allow one of these in that is doing the same thing as a casino? So a really different kind of way of imagining these things. Yeah.
Well, we actually have a couple in Manhattan, but they're quite dangerous because they have to store an extraordinary amount of additional fuel in case the electrical grid goes down. So the fire departments have all sorts of concerns about having them right in the heart of the city. But so I just have a really mundane question. In terms of, do any of these have a cogeneration aspect where they capture the waste heat and reuse it?
Within the structure?
Yeah, or just somehow reuse the waste heat.
Well, this is the talent project, so this is the pilot project.
Oh, I see,
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
I suppose what they're doing is Amazon are building, or they're investing heavily in wind farms at the moment to produce renewable energy. The way the Irish grid works, and I'm no expert on this, that you can't use, if you have a wind farm on site, you can't use that electricity, you have to feed it back into the grid and then back down into your, so they get the same breakdown of renewables and fossils as the rest of us really. Now again, I could be, there's probably parts of that I'm totally wrong about, but I think that's the way it works. So yeah, the first instance of recycling waste heat is Tala.
That is like a big suburb of Dublin, not big, 100,000 people, very large. So
Yeah.
you can
Yeah. And that's it. Yeah.
But would it not also be feasible then to feed it back into themselves?
as an electricity
Yeah.
producer.
To run a turbine.
Yeah, it's just you can't really stress enough how much, like, they take really, really nice electricity and they turn it into the crappiest output possible. So even the waste heat to heat a home has to be boosted by a pump house, like an energy center. In Germany, they have, like, incinerators that use these district heating systems, but the kind of general standard of the housing, the insulation quality, they can actually use the low-grade heat to heat homes, but here it doesn't work. So you have to actually boost it back up again, even just to heat a home.
There's no instances of identifying compatible functions, let's say, like archive. I don't know, I'm just trying to think of it. But how would you even broker that, I suppose, with just what might need sort of residual heat
Yeah.
that could reasonably sit alongside a data
These-
center, notwithstanding the risks in terms of fire and so on.
Yeah.
That would be good.
Well, it's a very good point about the kind of gas, or the gas leaks or the diesel storage, something else. But I think, yeah, like these things, I'm kind of injected in that way, or these things are here to stay. Like our society is built on this stuff now, like we're sort of all in. I think that it could be, I think what could be interesting is the idea of municipal data storage that is no longer, like a municipal cloud. These kind of things could be much more interesting than trying to kind of figure out what to do with these delinquents, you know? You know what I mean?
I mean, as a kind of utility.
As a utility, yeah, and then you use the waste heat, and then it becomes transparent, and the time it is, and these are open. You got to wonder about kind of plugging into a private company like this, in this sort of way, and, you know, again, the person swiping right on Tinder in Malaysia causing a puff of heat that heats a hospital bed in Tala, those relationships are too complex for us to be kind of, you know.
And is there analogies then, like think about electricity and the generation of electricity? And, I mean, I don't know about history, but I imagine in the first instance that was private companies
Yeah, I think.
delivering it, so to speak, and then at a certain point somebody identified that it should be a utility.
I think it works right across this new technological space we're in. I think we're in the robber baron territory at the moment, where people are making, like the railroads, people are making a lot of money because there's no regulation. I think there's things happening behind the kind of firewall of Amazon. Like, for instance, actually the most surreal kind of way of sort of thinking about this is that the buildings in Tala, there's an artist who's really interesting and his work is great, called Paul O'Neill. He's an activist who sort of visualises these kind of structures. He does walking tours from this docklands out to the data centres and things like that. But he was going out to these for quite some time. And if you go up to the data centre, if you look at Google Maps and you type in Amazon data centre, it'll bring you to this building. And there's a security guard there, and you say, well, is that the Amazon data centre? They go, no. It's not. I don't know. What is it? I can't tell you. You're like, okay, okay. And then so he moved around the building at one point, or one of them, and he was taking photographs of it, and the tannoy system just came on, please step away from the building. You know, so he got into an argument with the structure in the side road, but it's a structure that doesn't even want you to know it's there. It's a vast building, you know, but it's kind of hiding from you. So this kind of idea of like, there's some companies like Facebook are a little bit more kind of like, just a little more a little bit more self-awareness. Amazon are deeply strange in the way they relate to the and local public. So for all intents and purposes, Amazon aren't even in Ireland, you know, the way they'd like it, but you know, it's easily found out, but they're, you know.
Yeah, a couple of years ago, people were complaining that Amazon didn't have a warehouse here because we couldn't get goods fast enough.
Well,
We had to get it from the UK.
Yeah.
I mean, that doesn't matter anymore because they're only interested in server farms.
That's it, yeah.
We're not really interested in the speed of the process of getting our widgets from Germany to here.
No.
It's just.
And the critical mass of Ireland wouldn't be enough for them.
No.
They're happy to have their data center. I think it's a good way to think about it. We're an infrastructural backyard to the rest of Europe at the moment. Like all of our carbon goals are being distorted because of processes that are actually happening elsewhere. So it's, again, just because we have electricity going into data centers doesn't mean that's our industry in any case. It's an industry that belongs to the planet, and we're just housing it. And our carbon goals are being distorted quite dramatically as a result of that.
Well, especially because it's creating so few jobs, right?
Almost none, yeah.
And when did this start, roughly?
About late 90s, you start to see them a little bit, but really the last 10 years, I think you start to see the explosion.
Because 5 or 6 years ago, in fourth year actually, we did a project with students on power systems, and we looked at different kinds of power systems, you know, wind, water, and so on. And one group looked at data centers. And a lot of people were surprised that the cloud wasn't actually a cloud.
Yeah.
It wasn't something ephemeral thing somewhere.
No, it's really very much not. It's a burning furnace on this earth. Yeah. A good way. I was talking to an artist recently. I don't know who came up with it. It was after a good few glasses of wine, but he kind of, the term "a virtual hole is a real hole" came out. Like for every kind of, he works primarily in computer game. He's another member of Annex actually. He works primarily in computer game space, but he's really interested in the relationships between like. Grand Theft Auto is the game that he kind of primarily uses to kind of further his ideas, but he's running a project at the moment which there's this particular street in a city that's supposed to ape LA, and he there's a kind of a Skid Row type environment, so it's kind of homelessness, it's got a lot of kind of rubbish or whatever, and he was monitoring, he's worked out that every piece of rubbish has a certain footprint, like in his server somewhere. So when you load the game, it loads the rubbish, it loads the street, but it's not housed directly on a kind of CD or anything like that. It's kind of housed on a server somewhere else. So if there's I think there's 100 million versions of that game sold. So if whatever amount of those game players are playing that game at any one time, there's X amount of trash being loaded. So he's worked out the energy consumption of that trash being produced, and also the kind of minerals down to the very small amount that are used, like so the physical hardware that stores the trash in a computer somewhere else. So the rare earth minerals that go together to create a motherboard onto which that trash is stored, and then the electricity used to keep that trash alive at all times for people to pull in. So he's going to work out exactly the footprint of virtual trash on the real world, which is a completely kind of mad way of kind of thinking about the online environment, but it's a way we're going to have to think about it, because if we're building cities online, that's using resources, that it's literally carving the earth up to produce that virtual space. So no longer can we think the virtual and the real to be in any way separate. They're both the same thing in some ways. They're both material, you know, which is a kind of, it's a really interesting way of thinking about it. Well, it's a scary way, but it has to be. We need to change the consciousness about how we think about the internet and how we think about what's outside the screen as well, and relationships with the screen. So Grand Theft Auto, by all accounts, is a city that exists. It's just abstracted in some various ways.
Okay. Anything else?
You were saying earlier that these data centers, they're trying to be as hidden as possible, which I say is true for some people, but I'm living in Dublin West area, like they're 5-10 minutes walk from Amazon and Facebook data centers, and they're just awful buildings to look at, and they're not really hidden because Facebook is building a new data center which is really next to the entry motorway, and like thousands of people are seeing it, so they're not really hidden anymore. And I don't know, like I always thought why they were built here in a suburban area, because like they're just we can just compare them with some prisons. You can get in, they're just huge mammoth buildings dropped out of the sky, and they appear there. And you see them every day. I see them almost like 5 days a week. And they're not nice to look at.
This is my point about the contextual nature of them. They're hyper-contextual. So they don't drop out, they do drop out of the sky in some respects, but they're very, very, it's almost like acupuncture, global acupuncture. So the reason they are near your house is because there's a fibre optic cable called the T50, which just goes in parallel to the M50. So it's a cable that's, you know, basically wherever the M50 is, this T50 is, and they're extending it now. But what you have then, the first kind of, to get a spur off that fibre optic cable costs a lot of money. So you find that the big Amazon, Facebook, Google have the money, the capital investment to build a data center near that cable. And then what you have then is a secondary order of data center who feeds off the initial investment. So they have a thing called clustering. So you find there's always the big cable, then you have nearby, you'll have a big data center, like the big ones, and then off them you'll find more and more. So around Facebook you'll find in the next 10 or 15 years more smaller data centers. So Get used to them. So that's, yeah, it's got a clustering effect. And there's a big cable coming into Killala Bay, and it's built by Eoghan, Google and Facebook. It's a big cable that's coming into Killala Bay in Mayo. And that I'm sure the cable will traverse back to Dublin, but that's increasing our capacity for data transfer by orders of magnitude, which means that we can make more of them. We're not building the energy supply.
In terms of like keeping all this, because you're talking about all these servers, like I know a lot of them are just Amazon, Google and everything, but in terms of like servers, wouldn't like government-run agencies and also like the military also have a lot of these servers that require cooling, and those definitely are supposed to be secret. So what kind of like, would those also be able to be harnessed?
Well, Amazon's a good point. The American military store their information. They did anyway, but very recently stored their information in AWS cloud services. So basically, like the capital investment, and this is the problem with municipal data center idea, is that Amazon and Facebook have so much money that and technologically they're so far advanced that they're still the safest place to store anything. They can kind of reliably maintain the order and shape of the cloud. So when we build local ones or smaller ones, maybe they might be more susceptible to kind of hacking or whatever, or sort of server failure or whatever. So there is a kind of problem there with investment. The scale in which these guys can invest means that they are still the most reliable systems. And that's why, like for instance, the American military like the NSA have their own data centers in Utah, I think. And there was a lot of controversy about water consumption in their data centers. But sorry, did I answer your question? Or not? I sort of half answered. My brain is server failure.
I'm just wondering, because if these supposed like where they keep all their data is supposed to be quite secret in a way, it's like one of their worst kept secrets. Like, could that energy also be harnessed in the same way we would potentially harness like Google's or Amazon's, who try to keep it secret but don't really?
I don't know. I think the scale is probably. Still too small. I think even if Ireland, if the Irish government transferred all its data into data centres, the scale would probably be still quite small compared to Amazon. You think they're kind of global data storage operations, and that's again by the American military. It's quite interesting with Amazon as well. The guys who work in the data centre don't know what data is in the data centre, and the people in the office don't know where the data is at any one time. So it's this kind of the data. It's good not to think of them as static as well. The data always circulates around, or in duplicate or triplicate. So it's a kind of but yeah, I think a scale issue would probably be the problem. No, I don't know. I'm just guessing.
It's said that the best way to hide a tree is to put it inside of a forest, or plant the forest around it.
Yeah, there you go.
There's no need to build special secret data centers, I guess, because
You
of
just
that.
put it into the big system and wash it around. If you move it enough times, it won't be found.
You were talking about how we're not building energy capacity, but then we're building more centers. Is that why they're getting the interconnect?
Yeah, I think
Perhaps.
so, yeah. I think so. I think we're, again, I don't want to speak too much because I would just be probably incorrect, but I think that's my gut is that well, the interconnect is definitely to fuel data center storage, but whether there's other projects in the pipeline, I don't know. If that's true.
Okay. That's brilliant. I think we could probably start setting up for Eoghan. Yeah, grand. Do you want to take a small 5-minute break? And then,
No, just
yeah, yeah, grand. No minutes, 0 minutes.
Okay.
It's really
I'm
long.
not very good with the Irish last names, but Eoghan O'Mahony.
Very good.
I practiced. He's our next one, and he is a geographer and educator interested in how exclusion is created and maintained within urban settings. And he likes to work alongside others, creating new ways to look at the city we live in and how they can be made better. He has a PhD in geography and is currently a postdoctoral researcher involved in a project about renewable energy location tools. He also works a lot with GIS, and by his recent publications use spatial data and GIS tools to help to understand the dynamics underpinning urban exclusion. So welcome Owen.
Thank you. Okay, so hope you'll be moving at the end as well. So I was asking Donal at the beginning, we were trying to figure out a common thread between the two talks, and I think I discovered one about 5 minutes into what Donal was saying. And that is this idea of buildings obscuring function, and the increasing tendency, and I'm not an architect, the increasing tendency for building facades to obscure those functions. And I'm going to frame this both historically and contemporaneously around the site of the Magdalene Laundry, because that was implied in the Open Heart City theme. So I'm going to take it slightly down to a lower scale, not really talk about global processes so much, and talk a little bit more about the local scale in terms of how buildings conceal their functions, and increasingly so in the context of urban development. So I've called this critical intervention in the reproduction of social space because, as has been announced by Ella, I really am interested in how social space gets reproduced. Now, it doesn't get reproduced neutrally, it doesn't get reproduced as a natural process. These are political decisions taken. These are decisions taken by people for particular reasons. And I wanted to structure the way in which I talk about this critical intervention in 3 particular ways. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of my own work. I'm going to talk about the work that I did for my PhD thesis. And that is about understanding the role that memory plays in urban settings. So that's an attempt to try to get us to understand how we memorialize places, and how places in turn re-energize those memories as time goes on. And of course time, as Donal's already implied, fire is the thing that we all burn in. You know, we all end up as kind of eventually being destroyed by the fire of time. Secondly, I want to talk about connecting the idea of memory in place with some dynamics of urban social reproduction. By all means, not all of the dynamics of social reproduction, merely some of the more salient ones that I want to bring to the discussion this afternoon, so that I can make a convincing argument. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the work produced by David Harvey and others, which some of you probably read and talked about. And then I'm going to finish off by asking you a couple of simple rhetorical questions about things that you might want to consider. So these are critical voices from urban geography. So these are ways in which we can understand the reproduction of social space in a different way, which will leave us hopefully with questions about what the Magdalene Laundry is about, and how we might see its position within the city as a whole. So firstly, I want to talk about memory and placemaking. And this is, of course, an older map of Sean McDermott Street, and we can see here immediately the location of Sean McDermott Street within the northeast inner city. It has a particular resonance obviously for the people living around there, but also for the wider city. So I wanted to frame this in terms of how we understand the role that buildings and places make our memories, and in turn reinforce each other in that way. So I'm drawing principally from a couple of different people's ideas, initially from Holcher and Eoghan, who talk about the preservation of recollections, and they talk about this in the context of memorializing the Holocaust in particular. They talk about how these recollections, these are rested on their anchorage in space. So we must see these as physical processes. We must see the memorialization of public space and of physical space as something that anchors our memory and anchors our language in space itself. Okay. For Niamh Murcherry, a colleague of mine in geography, she's written extensively on preservation and urban regeneration, specifically around the Docklands, which is not a million miles away from where the Magdalene Laundry is. Memory is critical in the formation of both personal and place identity, that should read, but it is also crucial in shaping discourses on preservation, development, and how heritage is defined and represented. And I want to talk a little bit about this idea of how heritage is defined and represented. What we're talking about with the Magdalene Laundry Site is the preservation of something that people deem to be important, but also is deemed to be, quote unquote, heritage. So it is being defined automatically as something that is distinct from just another place. So heritage tends to become more preeminent when organised doctrinaire religions recede into the past. So heritage comes to the fore when religious affect tends to wane a little more. That has tended to be the feature of many of the ways in which geographers talk about this. Memory becomes attached to places that are at the same time both concrete, you know, they're physically present in space, in my case a Marian statue, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a minute, and they are performative. So in other words, your practice at the location of a Marian statue is performative in that place. So it is begetting of that place. There is no way in which you can separate the concrete and the performative in that way. So memory acts as a way in which we perform our reproduction of social space in itself. So we cannot functionally separate the performance of a ritual at a particular location without memorializing something. We're not conscious of that. We're not always thinking. When I am praying at a statue of Mary, I am not always thinking of the historical figure of Mary 2,000 years ago, but it is about what Mary represents for people in terms of purity and chastity and being both human and godlike and so on. So there's ways in which we can unpack those ideas around how memory is concretized into place through our performance. So for me, and I'm coming to some kind of understanding of the relationship between memory and place, memory is a way to exert control. Okay? So how we memorialize is a way in which we control the spaces that we create and recreate. Now, what I mean by control is that there's no single body in charge of controlling memory, other than perhaps a heritage council which wants to designate certain spaces as being, important, therefore worth preserving, but they don't take on every single last piece of the urban or rural fabric in order to memorialize those places. Those are selectively done according to political orchestrations and manipulations. So memory is a way to exert control over a place. And we should begin to think of the Magdalene Laundry as a way in which we can control how we organize our memory in that place. Am I making some sense? Is that coming to some understanding there? Now this didn't turn out so well on the slide as I thought it would, but this is directly from the doctoral work that I did. What I did was I mapped the Marian statues across Dublin City to understand the social change processes that occurred in and around those locations. So I got about 30 Marian statues all around the city, and I began to understand the relationship that those statues had with the creation of public housing between 1930 and 1970. So again, it is very difficult to separate the material culture of Christianity, and specifically Catholicism, and the creation and recreation of public housing within the city of Dublin. So we can't really separate the two of them as if somehow that's religion and that's secular. So in my thesis I was arguing that the two are embroiled and manifested and materialized within public space in a particular way, and we see this specifically in relation to public housing. So we can see clusters of public housing in the northwest inner city, in Cabra, in Glasnevin, in and around Fossa Avenue, and then in the south inner city we have areas in and around the Liberties, which has another cluster of Marian statuary. And this tells us a lot about the way in which public housing was conceived, but particularly about grounding Catholic devotion in neighbourhood spaces. So they were put on green space in the middle of public housing facilities. They were put in green space in the middle of public housing facilities. Usually the funds were raised by the local community themselves in conjunction with the parish. It's not as if the church said, oh, we see you've got a nice green space, we're going to put a statue there. So these things were done in combination with the people who moved into the areas in Cabra and Northeast Inner City and in the Liberties. And as public housing spread between the 30s and the 50s and the early 60s, we see a proliferation of statues, and we have a couple of outliers there in the South Inner City, or in the south of South Dublin, in and around Dunleary, where there are 3 Marian statues in and around, again, public housing complexes. So what the statues do is they ground Catholic devotion in a real and concrete way. They are concrete things in the landscape, and they allow us to understand the performance of Catholicism in Ireland at the time. So this is a way of the way we might understand how memory works. Memory works in these places in particular ways through the grounding of Catholic devotion. And trying to understand, this is the major question that I was trying to answer in my thesis, and now 5 years afterwards I think I've finally come to some better understanding. When we're thinking about memory and placemaking, we have to understand that the religious and secular exist in relation to each other. So they don't exist separately. There's not the secular realm and the religious realm. They exist in relation to each other. And it means us paying attention to the conflicts that are inherent between the religious and the secular. And these conflicts that are inherent within urban settings allow us to unpack broader political contestations about space. So, for example, in these three particular examples, we can see that this was in the Timber Yard in Dublin 8, just off Cork Street, on the left-hand side. This was a statue that was taken out of the derelict site where the Timber Yard building sits. The statue was put into a skip, and the local people came out and saw that it was in the skip, took it out, saved it for a couple of years while the Timber Yard building went up, and then insisted the developer, in conjunction with the City Council, that the statue was put back into the Timber Yard building in approximately the same location. This is in the last 10 years. This is not 40 or 50 years ago. So people, through their devotional and performative practice, were interested in maintaining a memory of Mary in the neighbourhood. Okay? So it's not as if these are enormously religious, devout people. This represents a way of thinking about the relationship they have with space, and this place in particular. So this was built in, and the marble plinth at great expense was put in a new building. The middle image is of a new statue that was bought to replace a statue that was broken, lifting it out of the old Fatima Mansions public housing complex. So down on Rubin Street, there used to be a Fatima Mansions housing complex built in the 1950s, row after row of public housing. There was a Marian statue at one end of that complex. The statue was lifted out when they were regenerating the neighbourhood. It broke, and the people insisted that a new statue go in its place. Now the statue is now in a Zen garden. It's not on its own anymore. It sits within a broader understanding of the way in which these people like to perform religious and gardening experiences within the Rubin Street area. They have a community garden there. The Marian statue sits alongside other symbols of devotion and common practice. And then the final one, which is at Broadstone Garage, which of course has been done up since the last time I took this photograph. This is a site of a very large Marian statue paid for by the workers of CIE, who were public workers at the time it was built. They fundraised for the concrete statue to be placed in this place. And in recent years, they have put a sign alongside this when the Lewis went in alongside it, and they said this is private property. So for the first time, Mary became not public property, but private property. It became the property of the workers of the CIE Broadstone Garage. So that tells us about the way in which we can think about contestations at each of these locations. There's a political contestation around whether Mary should be put back into the Timber Yard building, very modern building, put into a very new space, putting memory back into place in terms of the Fatima Mansions, and putting memory back into place in terms of the renewed Lewis complex at Broadstone. Okay, so these are political contestations. They're very small political contestations. They're not vast ways in which we can understand the creation and recreation of space. For example, at Clonboris SDZ, or in the data centres that we've talked about already, but these are political contestations nonetheless. So what conflict are we noting when it comes to Marian statuary? That's a question for you. I'm not going to try to pretend to answer that question. What conflict could we note when it comes to the Marian statues? And this is from the Irish Independent in 1955. And in particular, I want to draw your attention to the fact that the statue, which is of Italian white marble, is surrounded by an ornamental railing that was erected by a committee representing the families in the district to commemorate the Immaculate Conception. So this is not a politically contestable space in the 1950s. We do this because we live here, right? But now it remains in place and perhaps is more contested. Perhaps people would begin to think maybe we should take a hammer to the statue and knock it down, after the abuse scandals and the physical abuse scandals of the 1990s and 2000s. So the statue has remained in place, but for some reason Marian statuary does not attract antipathy in the way that other sites have in terms of attacking churches and so on. So the control of the public realm through the idealization of the female body is one of the ways in which we can understand contestation. So Mary was a woman the role that the woman played in devotional practice within Ireland in the 1950s tells us something about how the female body and the female form was contested. So that's one way in which you can look at it. It also reminds public housing residents, in particular public housing residents, that their outdoor life, which is ordinarily considered to be secular, is also bound by their faith. So they say the rosary indoors, but when they go outside, they see the Marian statue. That's also to remind you that you're part of the Catholic faith. So these are contested political spaces. They were put in there to remind people that they are of the one true faith of the Roman Catholic Church. They weren't there just put by accident or as decoration. They were put there to make sure that people knew what religion they belonged to. Okay? So these are political contestations, even if they're quite low level, quite micro-generated political contestations. So, secondly, I want to talk about some of the dynamics of urban social reproduction. And in particular, I want to talk about how we forget, and this is where it links in with Donal's idea, about obscuring and forgetting what actually goes on in redeveloping our cities. So all the time, I'm going to argue, perhaps a little weakly, that one of the dynamics of social reproduction is about the obliteration of memory. Okay? So the first one that I want to talk a little bit about are the groundings for multinational capital. I'm going to draw an example out from each of these three things. So firstly, a single dynamic of urban social reproduction is that Dublin is now, as Donal has already outlined, a significant grounding for the flows of capital, and by capital I mean money, floating around the world, landing in particular places. Singapore, London, Frankfurt, Dublin, San Francisco, and so on. These are locations, and increasingly Nevada and Iowa and all these places where the data centers are existing. These are, I argue, templated redevelopment which tames. The space is tamed by the way in which they form and reform the buildings in these places. They exist on the same basis in Mulhuddart as they do in Tallinn. They're sheer concrete, right? They're sheer glass. They're the same form that is put up in many of these buildings, I'm going to argue, in Sean McDermott Street in a minute. And I'm going to argue that we're moving from sanctification of heritage spaces to obliteration. So in other words, we may have thought that the urban context and fabric was worth holding on to. But increasingly, the dynamics of urban social reproduction are obliterating the differences that exist between Singapore, Frankfurt, and Dublin. So I want to bring that out towards the end about how we're moving from sanctification to obliteration. By sanctification, I don't mean people blessing themselves. I mean people thinking about buildings as unique and singular and individual. We're moving from there to a context of obliteration. So, some of the groundings of multinational capital, very obvious statements here. Dublin's Docklands, in the last 5 years in particular, has seen a vast increase in the number of buildings being put in there. Cycling back down from Howth yesterday, I saw that there were 20 cranes on the skyline just over the Docklands alone. In the first boom in the 2000s, people used to talk about 100 people working around each of those cranes. It's probably now 80 or 75 people working around those cranes. That's just the nature of the building. Generically encoded spaces across Europe and North America. I've already alluded to this idea that the building that these, the form that these buildings take inevitably tends to revolve around certain motifs. It extends the place of work to the playground city. One of the big things that Google does, of course, is to extend the workplace into play spaces. And so now we're looking at concepts like the playful city. We're looking at where alleyways are being used in order to create a play space that exists alongside, but outside the workplace. So in other words, you leave work, you tag out, and then you go to the play space, which is very adjacent to the workplace that you just had. Or you do the play inside in the workplace itself. Not unlike what Ella and myself are talking about here in the studio, that people are, existing within these workplaces as played spaces and not just places where you earn a living. So this extension of the developer into the playground city is something that Philip Lawton and myself have talked about recently. So it recreates the global city without ever stating what that is. At the moment, it is not housing. Okay? We're in the middle of a housing crisis. It is not about building public housing, it is about building data warehouses. It's about building office space and apartments and high-end apartments, and we see some of the consequences of that in the last year or two. But principally, it's about the erasure of difference in becoming global. So in other words, if Marian statues represent a particular way in which Dublin did religion, we're now looking at the obliteration of those differences, the reordering of those differences into something quite bland and ordinary and facade-like. It's got a certain facade that tells you this is an office block, this is a Google building, this is a data warehouse. Okay, so this is about smoothing over the differences that exist across these different places. You can see this repeated in the documents many times over. So these, to me, are some of the groundings of multinational capital. So secondly, template redevelopment. This is a picture from Carl Kinnean's work, and Carl's done some work on this innovation district down in Google. What I'm putting this picture up for is to illustrate the point that we've got the old and the new existing alongside each other, and we're seeing the reusing of the old in conjunction with the new to create a kind of a Google Play space within the innovation district. So this is repeated over and over across the world. We're seeing the same forms of buildings and the same forms of public space and increasingly privatized public space across different parts of the world. Global cities are demanding global ideas, and they're demanding global materializations. So in other words, we're seeing pulled pork bars and nail bars as being an essential part of the globalization of Dublin as a city. So we now recognize these things in our head as existing, oh, that's just like London, that's just like San Francisco, that's just like Frankfurt. Okay, so these things exist in the same way across different places in the same way. Redevelopment that induces forgetting, and I would argue that this is what's happening here, is it's obliterating the differences, and it induces forgetting about what previously went on in these places. So memory in itself becomes attenuated by the act of redevelopment. And as John Nagel is arguing in the article that I've sent on, the composition of elite-driven branding strategies render a schematized, labelled, univocal and linear narrative of the city centre which tames and romanticizes the disorderliness of the little city. So what this is serving to do is to smooth over the differences that exist across different locations. And not only that, we get templates of redevelopment. We get the same thing landing in Mulhuddart as we do in other parts of Europe. We get the same thing landing in the Docklands in Dublin as we get in new developments within London or in other European cities. Okay? Nothing too controversial that. But what it does do, one of the outcomes of that, is to create a univocal and linear narrative of what the city centre should be about. Okay, so that's quite an important political point which I'll return to later. So what Philip and myself have done over the last year or two is to look at how hoardings represent this templated development. And here we have the redistricting of Soho, which is, I think, the south of, what is it, the Beckett and, south of Beckett and something else. Which is meant to construct and redistrict this area. It's meant to recreate this area not as the Docklands, because that's too generic a brand, but is to recreate it as Soho. So this templated redevelopment, as Nagel is arguing, it rebrands while it may promote nostalgic visions of local heritage. In other words, it uses images of the Docklands and its hoardings. It uses images of men pulling ropes to bring boats to shore and so on, and uses pictures of anchors and life rafts and ships and so on. It does this to conceal the more problematic history of violence and inequality that actually existed in these places. So the Docklands were not a particularly nice place to work, but what the redevelopment does is it obscures the violence and inequality that arose from this previous location and seeks to use it but at the same time erase it. So it incorporates it into itself in the way that it thinks about reordering this particular space. So 6 Hanover Quay is a way of, if I could read you maybe the tagline, overlooking Grand Canal Dock, which talks about Grand Canal Dock as a place. Somehow we all know where Grand Canal Dock is. With an enviable location near the city centre, 6 Hanover Quay is perfectly positioned, that's what they're telling us it is, to enjoy the local area and take advantage of all the capital has to offer. Now again, capital is with a small c, but I would argue that it has all the advantages of what capital has to offer. In other words, the groundings of urban redevelopment as it goes across the globe. And so what we see here is this templated redevelopment working in many different ways, across different registers and not always appearing in the same fashion, but certainly evident in different ways in which we can think about development. So thirdly, I want to talk about, specifically I want to talk about the site of the Magdalene Laundry Site, Sean McDermott Street. What we're seeing with the attempts to bring the Sean McDermott Street back into the urban redevelopment cycle, taking it away from a hotel, which it was going to be sold off to an international chain, and perhaps inviting, as Gary Gannon has suggested, that we bring it into play from the National College of Ireland point of view, is to me representing no better an option than the hotel. Okay? If you bring the National College of Ireland into the Sean McDermott Street site, the National College of Ireland are not a neutral observer in this. They have a prime site in the middle of the Docklands already, which was gifted to them by the state as an anchor around which other Docklands developments and apartments could take place. It's not as if the NCI is a benevolent state-funded organisation. The NCI is not a neutral observer when it comes to Docklands redevelopment. So to perhaps consider the Sean McDermott Street is a further obliteration of the kinds of things that we haven't yet decided should take place at Sean McDermott Street. This remains open, it remains contestable. We should not seem to lock it down by placing another large institution, which effectively what the NCI is, albeit an educational institution, far more beneficial than what was previously at the site. So from Claval's point of view, the idea of heritage emerged at a time when religious or metaphysical beliefs ceased to exist as the main basis for collective values and social life. So if we designate this place as a place of heritage, we're designating it as something more important than mere existing in that place. We're telling people, oh, this is heritage. You have to be careful with this space. But I would much rather we see Sean McDermott Site as a place in which the possibilities can be opened back up again and not closed down as a site of heritage. So to not give it to the NCI would be a far more radical act, in my view, than to hand it over to a state or semi-state institution to create a memorialization of the pain, violence and inequality that happened there. And I think it opens it up far more if we think of it as a liminal space, as a place that is not locked down by templated redevelopment in the form of the NCI, a Tokyo branded hotel or whatever. So I think what we have to engage with is a form of reflective nostalgia. Not nostalgia for its own sake and to hang on to something that caused us great pain, right? This is a place of great pain. But we should not seek to somehow cover over, obliterate this pain because of an institution that needs to be placed there, so that we can also have a little bit in the corner where, you know, there's a cross or maybe a statue of a woman or a statue of a baby and a woman, you know. These things will end up being in that way inevitably. So we have to engage what Claval and others have talked about as a reflective nostalgia. So, almost proceeding to the end, re-engaging with a reflective nostalgia should not mean that we return to something that has caused great pain, but that pain is seen as ongoing at that site. It's not something that's just locked down. It's not something that's just finished, and now we just create a memorial and that's the end of the process. So I think this reflective nostalgia is anti-McAleese report. In other words, it's against what was contained within the McAleese report in terms of the compensation of victims of mother and baby homes and other industrial sites. And to me, and perhaps more controversially, it's anti-Mulvey. The Mulvey report sought to reconstitute the northeast inner city as a site of redevelopment. And I think it would be good if we engaged in this reflective nostalgia as a moment of anti-Mulvey politics. So in other words, we're not statifying. We're not making this place tied down. We're not obliterating the past in the same way as we would. So a memorial at Gloucester Street, Laundry, would seek to continuously shake up the comfortable myths of current consensus about a collective past. We haven't decided as a group of communities what the mother and baby homes mean. We still haven't really talked about these things. So let's not lock down the meaning by placing a memorial there in terms of another institution that's going to be placed. So I think what we have to do is to take back control of the politics that memory begets. So let's think about what it means to remember about the pain, the violence and inequality that happen in these places. Let's deal with that pain rather than thinking that somehow if we create a memorial, well, that's locked away now, we're done with that business, in the same way as others have hoped to do at pipeline sites in North America, in the way that others have done with the Jewish Holocaust sites in Germany. And so we've got to think about these things as a way in which we deal with the pain itself and not as some obliteration of pain. Because I think we're compelled to do this, because this is a political contestation that is still with us. 67% of the people that were committed to all industrial and reformatory schools were from the unskilled social class. We cannot deny that reality. We cannot deny the materiality of that fact. And as Rita Fagan has said, it's always been her view that poor people live on very rich land. And this is another example of rich people's land not being talked about as a resource of the people that live in and around Gloucester Street and Mecklenburgh Street. So we have to begin to understand what that pain means and then ask those people, what is it that you want to do with this site, rather than locking it down into some other meaning. So very finally then, I want to talk about things to consider about the Sean McDermott Street site. What does a right to the city look like in Dublin? Perhaps these are questions that we can tease out. That's a very big question. That's after David Harvey and Neil Smith. Who gets to decide how this space is used? That might be an interesting question to begin to unpack. Who lays claim to spaces like this? We haven't at all breached that idea about who lays claim to these spaces. What is permitted in locations? So after Bill Bungey's work in the 1960s and 70s, what is the oughtness of this site? What ought to be done here, rather than what must be done? What ought to be done with this particular place? How can we disrupt dominant understandings, which I've outlined in some of the dynamics of social reproduction, and parochialise these spaces to what we want? And that's after the Robinson work that was done in the UK in and around sites of memorialisation. So against the dominant understanding, which is about globalising space, I would argue that we should parochialise the space. We should make it more local, not less local. But we don't really fully, I think, have begun to comprehend what that might mean. What do we mean by parochialisation? I don't know. How will we understand that? What might that look like concretely? So these are some questions that I would open up. Maybe we can begin to answer them now, or we can cogitate upon them and reconvene in 6 months and then figure out what to do. So that's all I have to say. I'm happy to hear your questions. So.
Yeah, thank you. Any questions? We have those questions there.
Put those
Well, that
questions
could be no immediate questions. That can also be. Yep.
I thought you made some really excellent points as to what it could become, the site on Sean McDermott Street, and I know you kind of mentioned in passing basically there what it could become, and I just wanted to ask specifically what you think that space should be. Like, I know it's very in the air, but I'm just kind of trying to gauge kind of like what you could imagine in, you know, in a decade, what could be successful there.
As someone with enormous cultural and educational capital, it's not really up to me.
Yeah.
I think we've got to be clear about who this. I think we've got to be clear in our head firstly who this part of the city is for, and then begin to unpack what it is that we want to see in the space. If we've already begun answering our questions, and that people are giving out stink about the fact that there are lots of nightclubs closing, lots of pubs, lots of LGBT places that are shut down, informal spaces, the Bernard Shaw, for God's sake, all the and too many hotels and too much student housing. So we've begun to ask those questions, and we've come up with some answers. But I think we need to be doing the same now with this. We need to forcefully inject that question into our public life. The Sean McDermott Street thing focuses our mind in a way that the Bernard Shaw wouldn't. Because most of us in the room probably know what the Bernard Shaw is, but a lot of people outside this room probably wouldn't. Or a lot of people outside this campus probably wouldn't. So I wouldn't pretend to want to answer that question.
Okay.
What do you think should be there?
What do you think should be there? Still open for questioning, still learning about what I would think.
Okay, great.
Various different things that I'm hearing from people from the community. Some people were suggesting that they need more social housing, they need or housing for the elderly. There was a lot of support groups in the area that they were thinking should go in there, and especially for various agencies of domestic violence, etc. Because maybe because part of appropriation, part of it as well about memorials, as you're mentioning. It hasn't zoned in yet. We're still experiencing what we think should be there, but
it's interesting to me how the politics moved on very quickly from social housing to let's put the NCI on that site. And that's really worrying to me. That tells us a lot about the way politics works in the city.
I feel like putting that in there might, in a way, just kind of cover up a few things as well.
It anchors it in people's heads. In other words, oh yeah, sure, the NCI, they're a nice organisation. I have nothing against the NCI.
I know.
But the point is that it does. It covers up things in a way that this stuff is trying to uncover.
Yeah.
I think that's the best we can do. We've got all the time in the world. We don't have to do anything with that site in the next 40 years until the sea comes in on us. You know, we don't have to do anything.
And the floors are collapsing, so.
Yeah, absolutely. But let the floors collapse and let's look at what they form when they collapse.
Okay.
You know, why does the space have to be producing capital and profit? Can it not just be? Can it not just be a place? Albeit very dangerous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, I think it was a great talk. Thanks very much. Just a question around like the Docklands and the idea of global capital shifting around. Is it a question of like, do we have to rethink what we think of as nationhood and sovereignty? Like for instance, I was walking down by Facebook's headquarters the other day. Actually, I was filming it, and a guy came out with a balaclava. I looked at it, but it was kind of nice, which was kind of. There was something nice about this, but you see the way they changed the address. It's 4 to 5 Docklands, Grand Canal Docks or something like that, whereas actually the street is Misery Hill.
Yeah.
So Facebook's global headquarters should be 45 Misery Hill.
It should.
But there was a really interesting exhibition by Fishley and Weiss, the artists, many years ago, where they took photographs of airports all over the world. They were travelling the world doing exhibitions. And they presented all the photographs as one sequence of slides, and just one interior of an airport after another. And they sort of said, actually, this is a totally new type of space. These airports are not connected to any country per se. They're like not their own geography in which you kind of enter and organise. And what's your thoughts on the Docklands being its own geography outside of Irish kind of sovereignty, that's somehow existing in another sort of conceptual space? Like for instance, Whitewater Rapids are not desired by Dublin as a city, but they're desired by this new kind of space of kind of.
It's desired by a global city.
A global city.
It makes us global by putting Whitewater rafting.
But is Dublin no longer like, whereas there was a Viking city and then there was a kind of like there was a Celtic city or whatever? Are we seeing an Irish city and a kind of global city? And they live very closely together, but also they don't.
Yeah, but we have to ask the question: what is that for? What work does that do? Rather than trying to determine what the next stage is. You know what I mean? We have to begin to like. Nobody's interested in Dublin as a Viking city anymore. That worked in the 1980s and 1990s.
No, I just mean a kind of a bifurcation of cities, as in like there's 2 cities in Dublin at the moment. One which is run by the Docklands.
At least.
Exactly, yeah. But that's connected to a planetary scale sort of system, and then there's a local one.
Yep.
So is there a kind of clashing of sovereignty and nationhood happening at a kind of at multiple scales that actually manifest in what we recognise as something?
Yeah.
We recognise this as a traditional office or financial district,
Yeah.
but actually it's no relationship to Dublin.
No.
Really,
No.
you know,
So
we can wander into it.
There's a big bank of geography now emerging, which is about urban governance, right? So you probably come across some of this stuff in your own work. Like governance tends to be focused on, and it's a fancy term for government. Nobody's asking a really hard question about government. You know, it's like, does the government in Merrion Street actually run the Docklands in the same way as it does Finglas? No. Does it have a sovereignty over Ballinasloe in the same way as it does with the new Trinity Quarter that's being built? It's an open question. I would argue that there are different dynamics at play because there's more at stake in some places than in other places. And so the bill that you put up from Anne Rabbitte, I was going to say Pat Rabbitte, from Anne Rabbitte, shows you the importance of particular locations over others. So the flooding in the Shannon Basin will not be solved anytime soon, but the determination of special development zone designation for these places will be dealt with in a year. So that's the politics of it. That's not an abstract question. That's about what governance gets done in order to meet a certain goal. So I don't know about nationhood and sovereignty. I'm not so really enamored of that idea.
It doesn't, I'm just thinking about the statues you were talking about, and Lisa Goffin was there a couple of weeks ago talking about the church as a, first of all, international industrial scale operation. I mean, that's what it was. And the Magdalene Laundry was a small outpost of that, and the statues are mass-produced objects that in some ways are the same wherever they are. But at the same time, they become local and specific. In other words, there is a reading of the 19th century city, the late 19th century city, that says it's every bit as global in some ways, and therefore it's tied into colonial trade.
We don't tell ourselves that Dublin was a global city in the 19th century. We prefer to believe the narrative that we're now global. Because we got rid of the statues, but of course statues are still there. And we got rid of the church, didn't we?
But does that suggest then that it's possible to localise over time, if you know what I mean? That such forces will eventually settle? I don't know.
I think economic geographers are probably better pronounced than me to do that. But it's an interesting one. I mean, the old model of development in Ireland was you bring in the advanced factory, you pay for their location in again, Ballinasloe, and that somehow diffuses into the local area, and then entrepreneurs start taking up the same idea, and therefore we have a kind of a native industry now. That didn't work, right? So it doesn't work. But again, we've got to understand what are the dynamics of why that didn't work over anything else. The citing of Facebook here will not lead to 10 more Facebooks. That's the end of it. Because as soon as the first one comes up, Facebook will buy it. That's the reality of it. And we're going to get lots of apps built in Dublin, and then they're all going to be bought by Google. Because that's what they're doing. They're hoovering up innovation. As soon as they open up their first university, this place is finished. And this place, I mean UCD. As soon as they open up their first campus, we're done. Because they're going to start hoovering up all the ethicists, all the architects, all the geographers, all the designers and philosophers. They're going to start all towards code, all towards what code means. Sorry, that's me.
You might be better off if they hoover off all the architects.
Controversial.
So I'm working on a memorial project, so I found your lecture really fascinating. There's two parts to, I guess, my question. One is, you said something really specific about, and I don't want to misquote you, about the way the Holocaust has been dealt with in Berlin. And I found that really fascinating because for me, like the way Berlin and Germany more generally has dealt with the Holocaust is a sort of standout model. I mean, I would challenge the British people to ever deal with colonialism the way the Germans have dealt with that history.
Irish rock group Kneecap agrees with me.
Yeah. And I mean, sure, it's imperfect, and there are people that think that, like, had they won the war, Germany would not have quite the same memorialization. But, what I find extraordinary about Berlin is there's not just the large memorials of the concentration camps and then the topography of terror, but there's all of these small things.
There's the plaques
all
on
of
the
the
ground.
plaques and the ground. And so I found it interesting that you chose to sort of say, well, again, I don't want to misquote you, but that it was sort of parking the pain.
Mm.
Because I don't know what we're supposed to do as humanity that extends beyond what they did. Because to me what I find inspirational about it is the way in which life goes on there. I have very good Israeli friends that have flats there, and they have a lot of interesting conversations with their counterparts about this. And so that's one part of it, and it's related, this word parochialize, which I've never heard, and I've certainly never heard as a positive thing. And I worry about it because, especially in the context of the conversation in Berlin, because parochialize, I mean, there is a hardcore leftist argument against globalization. there's a hardcore right-wing argument against globalization. When Trump walks around talking about America first, he talks about global elites in almost the same breath that Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn might. And so this notion, I get the idea that I totally agree that we're losing our cities to this homogenization. But I also worry that the emphasis on local identity can charge up a certain animal spirit.
Okay, I'll come back at you and say, yesterday we had a report in the news of a leak from a report that's been published about 2 years ago on mixed race and ethnic minorities within the mother and baby homes. Now, we have never talked about this before, even though Christine Buckley was preeminent in pointing out, and she was a black woman who grew up in one of these mother and baby homes. We have never begun to understand what that might mean. We also have to incorporate the global Irish way of thinking about ourselves into the story of the. When I say parochialised, I don't mean this is ours and we're taking it. And it also involves black Irish people. It also involves people from Indian heritage and Caribbean heritage who came via Britain and so on. It also involves all of that. I don't see parochial thing as a way of. I think we've got to parochialise the politics of it, but not the outcome of that parochialisation of politics process. It's a really difficult
It's a tricky word.
It's
very localized, I understand. Parochialized, it gets into tricky water.
Is that not because of some baggage that we understand parochial to have, whereas parochial, if understood in physical, spatial terms? And it's interesting because others talk about putting the parochial and global ahead of the provincial, in the sense that the parochial need not be totally inward looking.
Yes,
absolutely. It can be placed and situated in a very particular way with, well, I'm not going to call it a global outlook, but I guess even actually in terms of
Open outlook.
with an open outlook, but also in a funny way actually transcend some of the religious things you're talking about, because within a parochial context you can have identities which may not be Marian, they might be Orange as well, within the same parish. Now, I'm really landing in the parish, but I do think actually that's powerfully enabling, and actually it's powerfully enabling in terms of what people are talking about. The kind of provincialism that's about border poles and bridges between Scotland and Northern Ireland, as opposed to saying a parish like places I grew up in Donegal would have traded all the way around the coast, down the south, down the Irish Sea to Plymouth or whatever. Anyway, I suppose the parochial and the network are things that actually, and of course, in a way, the church was the master of the abuse of the parochial way. And you read about the islands and the, on the one hand you have the cable coming into Valencia, and at the same time the church still trying to hold on.
Well, I would argue that sort of some of the most global locations in the 20th century in Ireland were the Magdalene Laundries.
Yeah.
Because they were drawing people from all over the British Empire.
And that, I guess that thing saying of the post-colonial context is one sense of our.
We've got to make the most of that post-colonial narrative, because we're not doing that very well across Europe at the moment. We're seeing again and again a turn towards the provincial in the way that you're painting it. We have a perhaps unique way of thinking. It's not about being white. It's not about being white and Irish, because there's all sorts of implications around Caribbean slave traders and so on and so forth. It's a way of thinking about this as both globally and locally connected. And I think only the people who experience this pain and this violence can begin to help us to understand what that means. Sociologists aren't going to help us with this. Although if Rita Fagan was to become a professor of sociology, it'd be great. But we can't deny that. Like these were global locations. They're not places. Like they sought to obscure the local. Take that woman away and don't make sure that everybody knows that she's had a child, or that she's killed one of her children. And it sought to erase the difference. We need to understand what those differences were first, and then begin to think about the site as a place of pain and violence. We also have to face up to that, and that involves globalizing that question. It doesn't involve saying, it doesn't involve putting a generic, formless memorial at that place. It behoves us to think about this as a unique response to these places. Not because we've now come to terms with the past and we've built some motorway structures. You know the way the percent for art scheme stuff, you drive down the country and you see the same percent for art scheme stuff. Wonderful pieces, but they're all done on motorways. Nobody really stops and looks at them on motorways. But like, we've got to think about what these places actually mean and then memorialize those places. It's not about a generic response. It's not about a I don't know, I'm rambling a little bit, but I understand your concern. Yeah, I completely understand your concern. And you probably know better than I do that Germany is still memorializing the Holocaust. It's not a finished thing. You know, each town is probably now thinking, what role did we play in this? That is not happening here yet. And we need to start doing that. We can start with Sean McDermott Street. And we can work outward. That will be a great start. No government is thinking about this. No potential government is thinking about this. And it's shameful. It's terrible. And we have enough shame in this fucking country already without going into, you know, without getting ashamed of ourselves about not memorializing things. They're global locations. They're tied to the empire. They're tied to the global church. They're tied to the nun who went and taught the black babies, which was the framing for me growing up in the 1970s. Penny in the box for the black baby. So we're deeply imbricated in global flows. That's the first thing we have to begin to do. You know, people said here years ago in the early 1990s, oh, isn't it great that people are coming from other countries to live in our place? They always have. You know, they were coming in boats in the 16th century from Spain, and there were you know, Muslims and Jews coming from Spain after the reconquest, you know? So let's open up those histories. It's not just about Sean McDermott. Let's make this a place of the global, not the global Irish, I fucking hate that, but, you know, let's force ourselves to think about what it means to be connected in that post-colonial frame. I don't know the answer, I'm sorry, I haven't got any answers for you. But let's discuss it. Let's talk about it. But we have to do it with the people who live there and the people who experience that violence. If we don't, I don't know, we're onto hiding onto nothing. Or we could just build a data center there, in the shade of your heart.
I know a couple of people.
Yeah. Which is an obscene idea.
They kind of are data centers. We expand the idea.
Yeah. But to obscure the building, like that's an obscuring building. That's a building that obscures the violence. That's the data center of the 19th century. The big box, which hid all that pain. People in the area knew what was going on. Everybody knew whose daughter and granddaughter went into that building. And just the same as everybody knows who the security guard in the Google complex is, but yet doesn't talk to the people who are taking photographs. So we've got to open the geography up, not close it down. I'll stop talking.
Any other questions? Okay. Can we leave it there? Yeah.
We invite them back to see what the answers are.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Come back in 6 months.
6 months from now, yeah.
I just as well, just to thank Vikram Chakrabarty, who's with us visiting incoming dean in Berkeley, and Vikram's going to be speaking tomorrow evening.
Yeah.
In the Royal Irish Academy. Connected urbanism?
Connected architecture and connected cities, yeah.
Which I think would have a lot of resonance with some of the today, so I think there's still some tickets available if you want to come along. So thanks anyway.
Sure. I really enjoyed both talks.